Hey everyone, welcome back to the Home Service Greatness Podcast. You got John and John here today with another great episode for you. Today is episode number 5, which is hard to believe. Time is flying by and these episodes are just pouring out, but we think we have a really good one for you today. It's about coaching up before coaching out poor performing employees.
Dude, I love this title because we put a lot of thought into how to provide as much value for our audience as possible. And one thing that kept coming up from all the questions that were asked is like, how do I help level up an employee? Or how do I help somebody reach that next level, right? Or if they're not working, what do I do? So John and I put a lot of time behind the scenes to make sure that we are just delivering on every single aspect today. So it's fair to say it's time to talk about coaching up or coaching out.
That's right. So it's no surprise. You all know that I have many, many years of experience in the corporate world, working at two Fortune 500 companies. And one of our consistent themes at those companies was having problem employees, difficult employees, troubled employees, whatever the case may be. Although we tried very hard to recruit properly, train properly, hire properly, occasionally even good employees would turn bad at certain times. So we developed processes that would help us coach up those employees prior to at least coaching them out of the company. Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about some of those great tactics that will work tremendously in your home service business. And first and foremost, it starts with communication, right? You have a troubled employee, whether they're dealing with something on the personal end or they're not happy with something within the business, you have to open the lines of communication. I know, John, you like to talk about running into the fire and having those difficult conversations right at the start. That's the best thing to do.
So I come to realize that so many different business owners, whether I'm coaching them behind the scenes or I'm just having conversations with different people in my circle, a lot of people don't really like to address problems head on.
Well, they don't like confrontation.
Nobody really does. But the difference between somebody that operates at a fair level of leadership and an excellent level of leadership is the excellence is always running into the storm. And I can tell you, the greatest tip we can kick this entire podcast off with is absolutely getting after that crystal clear communication, open dialogue, and running in and having hard conversations.
Yep. So a lot of times during that initial set of communication, you're talking to that troubled employee about what's going wrong, right? You're trying to figure out why certain behaviors are happening, why the processes aren't being followed. And the most important component is you want to get that feedback, right? You don't want it to be just a one-way dialogue where it's somewhat attacking that individual. Like, you're not doing this, you're not following that, you could do better. You don't want it to be like that. You really want it to have an open dialogue, back and forth communication where you're receiving feedback so you can make sure that there's nothing in your backyard as a business owner that has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. And I can say that open dialogue, that's what I'm catching from that is you're instilling trust. Nobody's going to open up to you. Nobody's going to show you their cards if you, like you said, you're going in and attacking them, showing them all their weaknesses. Because believe it or not, I'm sure there's a lot of great strengths in that person as well. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to attack them, nothing great will come out of that. And I can tell you, like, the next thing that will come out of that conversation, if it's done right, is you're going to be able to start to figure out like what expectations can be taken out of that, right? Like clear expectations in terms of like how to get out of the problem. It's easy to talk about problems. It's simple to talk about problems, but the highest achievers, the highest leaders are always going towards a solution. So that open dialogue will naturally turn into our next topic, which is clear expectations.
Yep. So early in my career, right out of high school, first couple of years in college, I started getting an interest in psychology, right? It was really interesting to me at the time because I was working as an operations supervisor. I started wearing many different hats in this business. HR was one of them, where I was doing training, I was doing hiring, recruiting, interviewing, the whole nine. And I started to develop a skill set where as I went through the recruiting and interviewing process, I would see how those individuals excelled within the business. And the major component to that excellence, that performance, was the training process. Now, what's amazing to believe, as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid in a management position at a Fortune 500 company, it was amazing to me how much emphasis these companies put on training, because the jobs were not difficult. They were very low-level tasks that the employees that we hired were performing. But the leadership and the culture of the business made us place such a huge emphasis on training because they knew that's the only way we could hold individuals accountable. And fast forward to today's day and age in the home service space, it's very similar in that aspect where the jobs that are being performed are not super high level. They don't require much critical thought, certainly some, but if the training's done properly, and there's a process I'm going to talk about, and I'll share with you a story of the training that I learned at this time that applies great in today's day and age. But when the training is done right and the individuals enjoy that training, they learn it, they can fulfill it, and they're able to be understood, they're able to understand what those expectations are, it's a much better transition into the workspace and excellence throughout the company.
So the first thing that will start to come out as, I guess, one of the greatest takeaways you can say that you gathered from working at these Fortune 500 companies was the training was it built out correctly, or did the management team not go over it correctly, or did the employees not follow correctly? Elaborate further.
So that's where the psychology came into play, because when I was inside of that human resource division and I was the one that was doing the recruiting and training, I was able to see, because I followed the training to a T, I was able to see those employees that I trained perform and excel very well in the workforce. But prior to me taking on those responsibilities, I would see individuals that they had great potential, right? They went through the recruiting process, the interviewing process, they had great potential to be successful employees, but they struggled in the training, whether it was not done properly or they just didn't understand it properly. And those sets of individuals more often would struggle in the workforce. So the behavioral mindset, the psychology behind all of it was the behavior was poor because the training was poor. And that's where the correlation existed.
That's powerful stuff, man. And I know you and I are really big believers in the training side of things. This business is like our business, our home service companies, like whatever we've done, we've come to realize, like, you and I have looked in the mirror quite a few times. We're looking back and saying, maybe it's really not their fault. Maybe it is our fault. And that's a really great takeaway, guys. So I can tell you that John and I do that quite often. Again, we like to operate in this world of excellence, right? The subjective world that we like to operate in, that a lot of people just, they come in, they show up as a manager, they do their best and they go home. For us, we're trying to always raise the bar. And one of the ways you raise the bar is by looking in the mirror and having that reflection and start to ask yourself, is your company handbook built out correctly? Are your SOPs dialed in? Do you have an operations manual for certain aspects of the business? Like, if you don't and you're listening, give yourself some grace, right? Don't sit here and beat yourself up. But start to get to work. Start to figure out maybe it's really not your team members, right? Start to do that reflection, understand where your blind spots are, and start to figure out how to bridge that gap. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you have to identify it first and foremost before you can start putting a resolution in place. Now, occasionally, it's not the business. It's not the business owner. It's not the leadership or the management or the processes, the systems. All that is good. And occasionally, poor performing employees are dealing with an issue on the personal side.
Yeah, it's true. And that I can tell you that I'll share a story. I recently just kind of unpacked that in my life. So there's somebody that works at our office that's been going through a really tough swing in his life, right? So this person has been a dedicated employee for God knows how many years, right? His heart is in the business, always going above and beyond. Is actually one of the smartest, hardest working people that I've had the opportunity to work alongside of. But something interesting has happened here over the last, I'd say, couple of months. Starting to see kind of a downward spiral. Starting to see a lot more negativity. I'm seeing some toxic traits start to come out. And again, it's easy to see this big storm over there and just let it rain, let it thunder, right? I'm going right into it. So I'll go in that person's office and I'll say, you know what? Can we have a chat? Notice things haven't been that great lately, right? And before you know it, there's a lot of pushback, a lot of unpacking that just doesn't want to happen naturally. But for myself, I actually genuinely care about this person. So for me, I go deeper. I work harder. I figure out how to peel the layers back, continue that trust, and eventually being able to have a dialogue. Well, come to find out, those issues, although from our management perspective, we're like, hey, it's just not good for the business. I think what we ended up uncovering was there's some really tough challenges happening at home for this person. And that's normal. And had I had just disqualified this person and said, you know what, it's not good for the business anymore, it's got to go, got to start talking about how to coach him out, it was, how can I show up for you? What can I do for you? How can I support you? Let's talk about taking some of that weight off your shoulders and throw them on mine. What can we do to spread out some of your stuff while you're going through this? Yeah. And before you know it, it's like, it's having an open dialogue. It's kind of like the weight is lifted off. And it's its own set of bricks when somebody has to repress feelings, doesn't feel like they can talk about anything. That's a whole nother set of issues.
Of course.
So just that simple dialogue was able to create a breakthrough in some respect. And it's funny though. Crazy part is, John, the next day, there was a shift in momentum.
That's what you'll see. Mm-hmm. And the biggest takeaway from what you just discussed was you led with empathy. Because it's very easy to discount, disqualify, and solely focus on the performance within the business. But the fact that you were able to have a tough conversation and uncover that there were issues on the personal side where there was trust built and you were able to talk it out whichever way you did, but you led with empathy and now you saw a shift in that behavior. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. That's where the psychology behind all of it really just intrigues the heck out of me.
Yeah. It's safe to say that because we focus on the solutions here, we obviously unpacked the problem, but we started talking about how to grow towards a solution. And I've come to realize that the greatest way to dig yourself out of the hole or quicksand with somebody that you actually care about and want to coach up is to start to talk about an objective improvement plan. So start to obviously talk about what's not going well, figure out how to show up for that person, but then figure out how to put your arm around that person and walk them towards a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day improvement plan. And when you have those targets kind of ahead, you can start to march forward with this person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So once you start reaching the plateau that you just did, right? You uncovered a few stones, you figured out there's issues that have to be resolved, and you're working towards a plan. The best thing to do at this point in time is work on a 30, 60, 90-day improvement plan. Whatever that looks like for your particular business, there's no cookie cutter solution or one size fits all. You really got to take a look at the individual situation, the individual employee, and put together a customized plan that the employee can feel success by improving their behavior during that time period.
And it's safe to say that we've seen it plenty of times. In that 30 days, you did your best to coach that person up. Mm-hmm. They spit out. It just didn't work. Yep. And that's the nature of business. It's cutthroat, it's ruthless, and sometimes it doesn't matter how much you lean in or pour your heart into somebody, they're just not, if they don't want it, they don't want it.
They don't want it.
Right? So it's like they might spit out in that first 30 days.
Yep.
But let's just say that this person is made it to day 60, mm-hmm. right? You're starting to acknowledge them and maybe you're just letting them know behind the scenes like how proud of how proud of them that you are, right? And you're starting to drive them out and you're starting to see light that 90 days. Mm-hmm. I think the coolest thing that we do here in our company and in the other businesses we've had is after they make it out of that 90-day window, we start to celebrate their wins, yep. right? Because again, it's not easy to run into that storm, have that conversation, but eventually the storms pass. And if you do it right after the 90 days, you're able to celebrate those wins. And I like to do it privately and publicly. So behind the scenes, it's like, so proud of you. You've put in your work and you've made it past like the worst. It's safe to say. The person's going to say, yeah, I appreciate you helping me stick along.
Well, I think for clarity, a lot of times during that 30, 60, 90-day time period, you're celebrating wins with that individual on the private level, mm-hmm. right? You want to make sure that they understand the success that they're achieving and rewarding them verbally, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. But the biggest takeaway is after the 90 days, then you start doing it publicly, right?
No
whether it's in front of the team, whether it's in front of the management level, whatever mm-hmm. the case may be, reward those wins, celebrate those wins, and the employee is going to feel much more part of the company while achieving that success.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, like where there's smoke, there's fire. There's the elephant in the room. Like everybody knows when somebody's not doing well. So it's cool to kind of bring that person publicly to light and like clap it up. Like, guys, we went through some tough times as a business, and at the end of the day, it's cool to see this so-and-so person be able to just completely break through and level up. It's like, let's clap it up for this person. It's like before you know it, all that team, all that camaraderie, all that love is just, it's what that person needs, right? It's that final phase, if you will, of coaching up.
Yeah, because a lot of times also during that 30, 60, 90-day time period, there's support from other individuals within the company, right? Whether that's training, coaching, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of individuals that were helping that single employee break through their shell.
Yeah.
I want to take just a few minutes to talk about this training process that I learned at a young age that works tremendously in almost any type of business that you have. And first and foremost, you have to make sure your standard handbook, policies, and processes are ironed out perfectly. Because the way this training process works, it's 7 steps. 7 detailed steps to make sure that any employee can be successful in the task that they're responsible for.
Let's hear them, man. Stop holding them back.
Are you ready?
Let's go.
All right, so first step is the trainer must read the process word for word how it's written out inside of your company handbook, right? The trainer reads that process to the employee. Step 2 is the employee reads that process. So psychology behind it is now there's a reading and understanding comprehension. Just a side note, majority of people are very poor at learning a task by just hearing it. So when they're able to read it and hear it in the first 2 steps, now they're one step ahead when it comes time to executing that task.
Yeah, that's fire, man.
So step 1, step 2, trainer reads the task, word for word how it's written in the policy. Step 2, the employee reads that task, word for word how it's written in the policy. Step 3, back to the trainer. The trainer will read each step in the task and perform the task at the same time. So however that looks for your business, read the task, it's done. Read the next part of that task, it's done. That's the trainer side. Same thing for the employee. Then the employee reads the task first, does the task. Reads the next step, does the task. Reads the next step, does the task. So on until that's complete. Step 5 is the trainer will just do the task. The employee's literally just watching the trainer do the task. Step 6, you got it. The employee does the task, right? So it's very detailed. It's somewhat time consuming, but following those 6 steps will ensure that that employee has complete understanding in order to remain accountable for whatever their task is. You close out this training process with step number 7, which is opening the floor for feedback and questions. Right?
That's amazing, dude. That's amazing.
Yep. Again, behind all of it, the psychology is that employee is reading it, they're hearing it, they're performing the task, repetitive several different times. Now, no matter what that task is and what that responsibility is for that employee, they have the best understanding possible.
Man, that's so good. Man, that's to me is like one of the greatest gold nuggets you can take out of this entire podcast, because you've done it and you've seen people be able to follow through those 7 steps and stay on track and continue to accelerate, I would imagine, right?
That's it. So when it's all said and done in the leadership and management style, once that employee understands it and they know what those clear expectations are to perform that task at a high level, there's no question about whether they're hitting the mark or not. Either you're following the steps that we trained you on or you're not, and we have to take some sort of action.
Yeah, and that leads us to our next part of this podcast, which that action, unfortunately, it's the dun-dun-dun, it's the coaching out, right? Nobody wants to coach anybody out.
Nobody wants to, especially when you invest so much time, money, effort into recruiting, interviewing, hiring, training. There's a lot that goes into it. And unfortunately, like you just mentioned, sometimes an employee is just not a good fit. Yeah. When you can look yourself in the mirror and know that you did everything you can to try to make that employee successful, when they're not a good fit, you have to get them out of the company. And that's where we talk about coaching them out.
And unfortunately, maybe it's not unfortunately, maybe it's just being authentic. The first thing you do when you want to coach somebody out is you want to give them a verbal warning, right? You want to be able to have that conversation and let that person know, just you're not hitting the mark. Like your standards are not being met. And unfortunately here in our company, we don't lower standards to meet you where you're at, right? We actually have to raise them and expect you to catch up with us. That's just the nature of the way we operate here. So the first thing we do is we go through the verbal warning, right? After the verbal warning comes the written warning, right? We start to go through a process. And guys, if you're listening to this, you think about how this applies to your business. Maybe it's a couple different verbal warnings, and then it's a one or two written warnings, and ultimately it's a termination. Whatever that is, make sure that it makes sense for you and your business. How many people you have matter. How much capital is behind your business. There's a lot of things that go into your exact termination process.
I guess just taking one step back, it's important that you have that written out in your handbook, right? Have it written out in your handbook. Make sure every employee understands exactly how your disciplinary process works so that there's no confusion, there's no favoritism, there's no cutting corners when it comes time to coaching an employee out.
So when it's all said and done, from a macro side, it's verbal, written, suspension, termination.
In those steps.
Yeah.
Yep. And there could be multiple verbal warnings, like you mentioned, maybe 2 or 3 write-ups. But ultimately, once an employee has worked their way towards a suspension, whether that's a week suspension without pay, 2-week, whatever applies to your business, once they reach that point, it's pretty much that's the last straw. One more mistake, not following the process, not meeting expectations, unfortunately, that employee has to be terminated.
Yeah. And there's been this fine line over the last 15, 20 years where it's actually a good human being, right? What's the analogy? It's the right jockey, wrong horse, wrong jockey, right? Whatever that is. I can tell you that it's actually a good human being. And you can see them working and being an incredible asset somewhere else. It's not always the case of somebody just not hitting the mark and being a bad person or stealing or anything behind the scenes. Sometimes it's great people. Right? So when we go down that direction and you do your final phase of coaching out, don't be afraid to lead with a letter of recommendation, right? Because that can help that person. That can serve that person. After all, we're all human beings, right? We're all trying our best. Just because that person couldn't hit your standards doesn't mean that they wouldn't be an asset somewhere else.
That's right.
I can tell you, man, there's been a lot of takeaways here, right?
Sure has.
Has there, I'm interested. Before we let everyone kind of go, let's talk about a couple action items.
Okay.
Right? So anybody can listen to this podcast, kind of take it in and absorb it and go off to the next one. For us, we want you to have some takeaways, like some real takeaways. So my greatest piece of advice would be this: on paper, on purpose. If for some reason you're sitting back today and you're thinking, wait a minute, this has really inspired me to kind of do an analysis of who's hitting the mark, who's not, do that. Don't overthink it. Take out a piece of paper. The first 5 people that come to mind, write them down, right? Write them down. And start to think about, are they really worth putting coaching up or coaching out? The chances are they're worth coaching up. So start there. Once you have that, the rest will follow. I promise you that.
Yep. I guess just to complement what you mentioned, as the business owner, make sure that your handbook, processes, systems are all buttoned up and perfect. Because ultimately, my action item for you today is to utilize that 7-step training program that I talked about and see how that can apply to your business, because I promise you, once you utilize that to its fullest potential with any behavioral issue from an employee, you're going to see a night and day difference within your company.
So good, bro. And I can tell you, always remember that everything lives and dies at the feet of leadership in your company. So do some reflection, hold yourself to a high standard, and make sure that you're taking everything we gave you today and applying it.
Johnny, great job, man. I want to clap it up for you right here. I just don't want the microphone to go crazy.
Yeah, man.
But thank you all for tuning in today. It's been an honor to speak with you about this great topic. We hope it can apply to your business and you can have a great takeaway from this podcast. So until next time, we out.